Welcome back to the Hawkeye Garage. I am Joe. This week we're going to do some maintenance on the GX, but it is not GX specific maintenance. If you've got some weird clunking or vibrations coming from underneath your car when you're either stopping or setting off from a stop, you might want to pay attention to this video because you might just need to grease your drive shafts. Stay tuned. Before we roll underneath the car and I show you guys exactly what I'm talking to as far as giving you some things to look for specifically and how to go about greasing some things and stuff like that, let's talk about the mechanics of how the drive shaft and more specifically the slip yoke works, which is causing or could be causing your clunk. And I've got a little demonstration, a little visual aid here to help. Now, on this type of slip yoke, where there's a flange on each end of the drive shaft, here that's going to bolt to the transmission, and here that's going to bolt to, for example, the rear axle, you have a small piece of pipe and a bigger piece of pipe, and of course this is all going to be sealed together and very tight. This is obviously oversized and extremely loose just for the video. Anyway, this is going to allow the drive shaft to get shorter and longer. Now, the exaggerated parts of that could be if you were going off-road, for example, and you're really flexing out your suspension and dropping your rear axle down. That obviously is going to make the rear axle further away from the transmission, which is stationary mounted to the chassis of the car. So the drive shaft needs to get longer. Or the opposite is true, that if you are stuffing that rear axle really tight to the car, stuffing those tires up in the wheel wells, that's going to bring the differential closer to the transmission, and you need to shrink down that drive shaft. Now, on a daily basis, that suspension is still going to move around when you're coming to a stop, and the vehicle's going to rock forward, bring the body up away from the rear axle, making the drive shaft longer. And we're talking about, you know, 1/4 of an inch, 1/2 inch at most, 1/8 inch, just small measurements, but it's enough that if you don't have proper lubrication in here, it's going to kind of make a clunk, clunk as the vehicle body rolls forward and then backwards, or backwards and then forwards, whether you're stopping or setting off from a stop. Hopefully that makes sense for you guys, and especially if you are trying to find a reason why your car is making some clunking, you'll get a light bulb and be like, oh, that makes perfect sense why it's doing that. I didn't know this for many years, up until, I don't know, a dozen years ago, and it's just been kind of regular maintenance on all my vehicles since then, but it's come to my attention that, like myself back in the day, not everyone knows about this. So, there are other kinds of slip yokes. We're not going to talk about those. We're going to talk about this kind today. Couple things to look out for before we go under there, just so you can kind of know what I'm talking about. There will be a grease zert or a grease nipple, basically a spot where you can plug your grease gun in and insert grease. On this type of slip yoke, usually the grease zert will be on the end of the bigger tube, so it can put grease around that joint, or it'll actually be up closer to the U-joint, and then it will pipe it internally down, which is what this has. Clunking or noise or vibration can also be caused by bad U-joints. Usually that's a little bit more pronounced. You might not even notice that this is clunking until maybe somebody points it out to you. Your wife is like, why is the car making that clunk noise? You're like, oh, I wasn't even paying attention. I didn't even notice it. We'll talk about greasing the U-joints while we're down there also, because if you're doing the slip yoke, you may as well do the U-joints, which you should be doing anyway, because it'll help them last a whole lot longer. So let's roll underneath the car and take a closer look, and hopefully my visual aid will make more sense. Underneath the GX now, we've got the rear drive shaft here. We got the transfer case, drive shaft going down to the rear axle, and right here in the middle of the screen is the slip yoke, the smaller end going into the larger end, and you can kind of see that worn area is basically a seal where they are moving in and out, and that is where the grease needs to go. And when there's no grease in there, they get kind of bound up and they don't like to go in and out. Right there in the middle of the screen, the little silver grease zert, that is where
we add the grease for that slip yoke on this particular drive shaft. Like I said, some of them have the grease cert down here. And this took quite a few pumps, and it just started to kind of move the drive shaft apart from each other, kind of started to stretch it out, so I stopped. I assumed it was pretty dry, and as I flexed the car driving around in traffic, it would probably start to squeeze some of that grease out. The missus was driving it around today. I did this yesterday, and I don't see any grease coming out, so I may want to give it a little bit more. Don't worry if it starts spitting out a little bit. You can always wipe it off, pressure wash underneath your car, not a big deal. But you would definitely know that you had enough grease in it at that point. Now, the U-joint, this is going to be a little bit more difficult to show, but on the U-joint, there's going to be 4 boots because there's 4 sides of the U-joint, and you can see some of this old grease started to spit out as I was pumping the new grease in. That's basically when you want to stop adding grease, as long as all 4 of them are doing that. If one starts doing it and then it takes a while for them all to do it, don't worry, just use a rag, wipe everything up. And again, you might want to do this, drive a little bit, let some of that grease work its way through, do it again. Until you have new grease kind of starting to poke out through all those boots, because it is not a perfect seal. It's just a boot pressed over the metal, basically. So moisture and debris are going to get in there. So if you can push all that gunk out with the old grease and then just clean up afterwards, that's where you want to be. And a dry U-joint can cause clunking. It can cause vibration because it's not allowing everything to move around in a free fashion. So that's where we're at as far as greasing your drive shaft. Now, if you have a CV joint instead of a U-joint, you still may very well have a slip yoke if you have a rear-wheel drive vehicle or a 4x4 vehicle with this drivetrain layout. You still can have a slip yoke that you can grease, even though you can't really grease a CV joint without taking it all apart. It doesn't have a zerk or anything on it. So be sure to check that if you've got some vibration or clunking before you take it to a repair shop or start throwing money in parts at your rig.
All right, I hope that helped you guys understand kind of the concept of how a slip yoke and a drive shaft works, and why it could be making that clunky noise. It's just a lack of lubrication, and they're just getting bound up on each other, the big tube and the small tube, and they're just being forced either together or apart, and it's causing kind of a jarring sensation. Actually, my front drive shaft has that same thing, even though with the independent front suspension on this and a lot of 4x4s, the differential is mounted stationary, just like the transmission, but chassis flex, things flex and move around, and you will get a little bit of movement. So having that slip yoke can help take a lot of abuse out of the driveline, some shock out of there. So be sure to check your front drive shaft to grease as well. On this GX, which is a Toyota 4Runner, and on the 4Runner that I had before it, each drive shaft had 3 spots for grease, 2 U-joints and a slip yoke on each end. So be sure to grease those before you go start replacing parts or taking your vehicle to the shop, because if you're looking at how to fix this, you probably have a grease gun and you're probably capable of doing it yourself. If you have any questions, because I didn't explain myself good enough, please feel free to leave them in the comment section below, or email me more in depth. We can go back and forth if you don't want to hammer it out through the comments on YouTube. HawkeyeSkunkWorks@gmail.com. Please feel free to help people through my email all the time with questions they have on their vehicle. So if you're new to the channel, please subscribe, hit that notifications button, drop a 4x4, well, usually a 4x4 related video every Sunday, but not always at the same time, so the notifications will let you know when that video comes out. I also do Wednesday videos more often than not these days, usually around mountain bikes, my other passion these days. So also follow the links in the description down below over to Instagram and Facebook, where I just post stuff daily, just whatever I've got going on in my life. So there is that. Be sure to check out the back catalog, because there's all other kinds of maintenance stuff and good tips and tricks for 4x4s and mountain bikes too. Until the next video drops, thank you for watching. Take care. Goodbye.